Now, the NATO summit in Prague pledged support for the United Nations over Iraq today. Nothing particularly noteworthy about that. It was pretty much the lowest common denominator. More revealing are the tensions between major countries like Germany and France and the United States. The French specifically rejected President Bush's interpretation of the UN resolution. Germany said it wouldn't join any strike on Iraq. So where does that leave Britain? We'll hear from the Foreign Secretary shortly, but first, our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, reports.
Singing from the same hymn sheet is a necessary prelude to war. But the NATO summit in Prague is one of those occasions that make foreign ministries nervous. It's a time when presidents and prime ministers take over, and who knows what they might agree in one of those cosy bilaterals. Policy can be made on the hoof here, like this statement by President Bush.
Saddam Hussein has been given a very short time to declare completely and truthfully his arsenal of terror. Should he again deny that this arsenal exists, he will have entered his final stage with a lie. And deception this time will not be tolerated.
That just put another problem in Jack Straw's in tray, because the Foreign Office line in recent days had been not to specify whether a so-called nil declaration would in itself put Iraq beyond the pale. The Americans have been upping the ante too on the question of whether firing at coalition aircraft is a breach.
Within that resolution, it makes very clear that Iraq needs to stop hostile acts against members who were carrying out previous UN resolutions, and the United States believes that firing upon our aircraft in the no-fly zone or British aircraft is a violation. It is a material breach.
British and American warplanes have been dropping bombs since that key UN resolution 1441 was passed. And it hasn't been hard for Whitehall to insist that London does not see this kind of tit-for-tat as a response to a material breach. The Americans, though, are putting down markers, ticking off these breaches in order to build up what they call a pattern of violations. In the meantime, Tony Blair and Jack Straw will have to get through another parliamentary debate on Monday, convincing the left of their own party that they're not being stampeded towards a war.
Well, I think the whole thing's been handled with a view to not letting Parliament know what's going on. I think the decision to go and side with the Americans in this totally unnecessary war, because they're not threatening anybody, was taken when our Prime Minister went to visit George Bush at his ranch in Texas earlier this year.
Once the government's through that trial, it may soon be tackling the issue of whether another UN resolution is needed to enable force. Washington and London both so far insisting it's not. Once these problems of whether something is a material breach of Resolution 1441 and whether another new resolution is needed to enable the use of force have been solved, there will still be one very important and difficult political corner to turn. All the way through this, Number 10 and the Foreign Office have insisted that Britain's aim in all this is the disarmament of Iraq. But if there's a war, it's highly likely that Washington will state its purpose from the start as being regime change in Iraq.
Mr. Saddam Hussein has got a decision to make. Will he uphold the agreement that he has made? And if he chooses to do so by disarming peacefully, the world will be better off for it. If he chooses not to disarm, we will work with our close friends, the closest of which is Great Britain, and we will disarm him.
If a military campaign is launched, though, its objective of overthrowing the Iraqi government will very soon be obvious, requiring another tricky policy shift. All of this adds up to a challenging few months ahead for the Foreign Secretary.
So earlier, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw. I asked him how many of the now 26 or almost 26 members of NATO would be willing to give military support to any American operation in Iraq.
if there's an operation in Iraq, it will be under the auspices of the United Nations. And amongst much of the history made today, there was a unanimous statement agreed in respect of Iraq, giving full backing to the United Nations and to that resolution 1441, and highlighting in particular that part of the resolution which talks about serious consequences if there are further material breaches. Everybody wants a peaceful resolution of the Iraqi situation, but everybody also recognises that the best way of securing that peaceful resolution of the Iraqi crisis is by being determined that if Iraq does not comply fully with the United Nations resolution, then military action may have to be taken.
My question was, how many of the now 26 will support militarily an action which may follow in Iraq?
Well, everybody around the table has supported the principle that effective diplomacy has to be backed by a credible threat of military force. I can't say exactly because nobody is counting and no one is assembling a formal coalition to deal with Iraq, because so far Iraq has been given one final opportunity to rid itself of its continued violations of its obligations under the United Nations. It's complied with the first of the obligations under Security Council Resolution 4041, which was to say that it would obey the rest of the obligations, and we now wait until December the 8th to see whether they comply with the second of the obligations, which is a full disclosure of their weapons of mass destruction and their means of making them.
If Iraq makes a declaration that it does not possess weapons of mass destruction, is that a breach of the UN resolution?
Well, operational paragraph 4 sets out that for there to be a material breach, there has to be a failure of a disclosure, and it's linked by an and a failure of other obligations under the resolution. So I don't want to get involved in a detailed debate about what may or may not constitute a material breach. Plainly, a flagrant refusal to comply with the requirements of operational paragraph 3, which are for this disclosure, might well be taken by members of the Security Council as material breach. But I hope we don't get there.
But what is our position? What is the British position? The French are saying it would not constitute a material breach. The Americans are saying it might well constitute a material breach. What is the British position?
Well, I'm saying we look at the words of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1441, and we make an assessment as is required by that resolution in the light of circumstances.
Well, the British government believes, because you published a dossier saying he has weapons of mass destruction, you believe he's got them. If he stands up and says he hasn't got them, the British government must have a position as to whether that constitutes a material breach of the UN resolution.
Look, if there is a false disclosure by Saddam Hussein, I mean, if he were to say that they have no weapons of mass destruction nor any means of making them, then I believe that would be taken by the whole of the Security Council as a violation of all the obligations laid down under 1441. Because, for example, under the last report of the previous weapons inspectors, UNSCOM, in February 1999, they said that there were still unaccounted for stocks of weapons of mass destruction, mustard gas shells, VX, nerve agent, and so on, which were unaccounted for, and the Iraqi regime has still not accounted for those. So we know what they've got to answer for.
Can I ask you another question then? Is the Iraqi firing on British and American warplanes in the so-called no-fly zone, is that a breach of UN resolutions or not?
The legal basis of our operations in the low-fly zone is not United Nations Security Council Resolution 1441, but UN Resolution 688. So a material breach of the no-fly zones causes other problems, and for certain it would cause retaliation, as we've always made clear, but not necessarily unless it was linked to a material breach of 1441.
But the American Defense Secretary has said it is a material breach.
Well, you've asked me, I've just given you an answer.
So there's a difference between Britain and America on that?
Look, you can always say somebody said this, somebody has said that. What we have is a unanimously agreed resolution, 1441, voted for by all 15 members of the Security Council, which lays out a pathway to a peaceful conclusion of the crisis with Iraq if only Iraq takes that opportunity, what's described by the resolution as a final opportunity. And what all of us are working towards is not military action against Iraq, but the avoidance of military action against Iraq by Iraq properly and fully complying with the obligations which have been upon it, yes, since November the 8th for this resolution, but in fact for the last 12 years. And I also have to say I'm here in NATO, delighted to be so, where we've expanded the total numbers of NATO to 26, and all 26 members of NATO, every single one of them, are agreed that Iraq must comply with that resolution.
On the question of this UN resolution, you're allowing MPs a vote on this next Monday. Will you allow the House of Commons another vote before any military action were to take place?
Well, I explained that to the Parliamentary Party yesterday, and I'm very happy to explain it to Parliament on Monday. If it is at all possible to provide for a vote in advance of military action taking place, then we will do so. There were circumstances, these arose under the previous administration in 1991, where because sometimes military action has to be taken without giving notice to the other side, we had to wait, or the previous government waited, but we agreed this, for 5 days after the military action took place. But the most likely course of action, if military action is required, which it is not at the moment, is that we go to the Security Council, which is where there will be discussion. Our preference has always been for a further resolution from the Security Council, and that would then be put to the House of Commons for further endorsement, just as this original 1441 resolution is being put before the House for endorsement on Monday.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.